Hi, Embracing Only podcast family. This is Archita. We are introducing impact moments, actionable insights that highlight the best and powerful learning moments and wisdom from our past episodes of incredible guests. In this highlight reel, you'll hear leadership lessons from a combat veteran, taking action to be anti-racist, mastering workplace negotiations, leveraging your uniqueness for success. We'll take a topic and break it down in a short, snappy episode. So click on the link in the show notes to continue listening to these impact moments with our amazing guests. Pivoting is a key part of who you are and how you give back and purposefully engage women and others in defining their career journeys. But you pivoted into the world of sustainable living and then further pivoted into coaching and created a partnership with your partner on engaging companies to drive sustainability. You continue to pivot seamlessly. So what drives that desire and that compassion to yourself as you pivot into these purposeful ventures?
I would say curiosity is probably the number one thing. And I got that maybe through the evolution of my life, having experienced at least cultures of 150 countries. I do think that we often hold ourselves to being the experts at something, this perfectionist drive, etc. And I've never really had that, but along the lines of neurodiversity. For me, perfection was never an aim. It was more about know enough to do enough and to get the ball moving. So maybe I'm more of a starter than a finisher, but I will work with people who can finish. And that helps me to be able to move my mind and pivot around different topics seamlessly as much as I can.
You just mentioned that starter versus finisher, like in some corporate workspaces or in professional workspaces, that can be weaponized against you.
Oh, definitely.
Has that been weaponized against you? How has that shown up in your career? Because you're adding value the best way you can, leading with and from your strengths. But how has that shown up for you?
I would say in the sort of corporate space, it showed up in my burnout. That not being a natural instinct for me, it meant that I had to spend that extra time. I had to give that extra effort to get to that point of getting things done. And I got things done, but it definitely cost me more than someone for whom it's natural. Whereas other people will be hesitant to start things. That's not my issue. So I think this is another thing that people need to learn as well. Organizations need to learn about neurodiversity. I think in general, companies have always tried to make blueprints and carbon copies of the type of person that they want to have in their organization. They give you the spiel when you apply to jobs and roles about culture, but culture is just another form of bias. Sorry to say companies, but this is part of the
Yes. Say that again. A company's culture that we weaponize as a positive thing is an absolute blueprint for bias.
Absolutely. I've also heard the thing like recruiters saying that they take 7 seconds to review a CV. That what is that if it's not bias? And again, probably we need to come back to this definition of bias because I think it's important. And bias could be positive or negative depending on who it impacts. But it also comes from several places. I would say that as long as your brain functions, there is some element of bias. And you can identify it in the emotions that you feel because the emotions are an indication of some sort of way that you've processed an experience in the past. And therefore, you have a bias in your emotional response to experiencing that again. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that I would say it's linked to privilege as well. So there are certain things like education levels or income levels or where you come from, etc., that tends to be caught up in what people are scanning, for example, on a CV, without them even knowing it. So this person went to Harvard. Okay, this person went to other university that I can't identify in a country I don't know. Immediately that gets dropped in the ranking. So with all of these things, it's difficult to really have a process that's easy to manage and be unbiased. And that's the catch-22 that organizations find themselves in when they run these HR processes, because they want to get the cost out So let's hire more of the same. We know this works, so to speak. Let's hire more of the same. And therefore, you come up with these kind of criteria. So it's definitely a challenging scenario to try to unpick this bias from the beginning. I think it is hard because if you have a track record or you have a sort of history of certain performance and results, it's tempting to go back into that. But the thing about it is, at this point in time, especially where we are in the world today, we need to start redefining the way we perform, the way we measure things, the way we value things. And that is where I think we have the greatest opportunity now to really embrace this idea that we need this inclusivity. Because actually, all these results we got in the past have led us to a place where we're low on resources, we're still dependent on Russian oil, things like this. So we need to recognize that the skills of tomorrow, more systems driven, first of all, more diversity driven, because actually that's nature. And now we understand how nature has balanced in order to sustain us. So it's really about us doing a little bit more than we did in the past. It used to be that science would mimic nature to come up with solutions. I think businesses need to do the same. And I think it's become more accepted. It's become more understood now. But still, in the execution, there's a lot of weakness.
Yeah, you're saying that it's become more understood, but the lack of deep understanding. Just this past International Women's Day, I was talking to your co-host panelist, and she mentioned that the dichotomy women face is that when you are you're strong, you're sure about what you're doing, they're like, hey, that's nice that you have an opinion, but you need to be more vulnerable. When you are vulnerable, it's like, hey, you're too emotional. It's like a tightrope you constantly walk. I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts on that?
Remember when your friend mentioned that in a session, and it's true. Men are expected to be tough and hard, whereas women are expected to be vulnerable and give a bit of their soul, etc. But for me, it's more about, what am I comfortable with? If you're not comfortable with that, don't do it. Like, really. You don't have to do what people expect you to do. It's really about carving out a space where you feel comfortable representing your ideas and your values and your views to this place. But it comes with a lot of, let's call it self-mastery. It comes with a lot of that internal journey too. So I think there's a lot to unpack when it comes to, should I be vulnerable or not? I think vulnerability, as Brene Brown says, it's not about a show and tell kind of thing. It's not about just calling things out. It's really about being intentional with it as well. So being a little bit purposeful with this vulnerability. For me, vulnerability is really about understanding, having processed what you've been through, the impact that has had on you. And I think it's important to have processed it. The common quote, you speak from the scar, not the wound. And that's how I see we should interpret vulnerability. It's something that we need to work through on our own, make sure that we've processed that experience adequately, and then we could vulnerably share it. But if you share it while it's still open, while it's still affecting you, impacting you, then you weaken your ability to add value.